Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
Every morning brought the same relentless routine where the scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee enveloped me like an unwelcome embrace as I tied on my apron at the Milford Diner, a place that had served as the heartbeat of our small Ohio town for decades, allowing me to scrape together just enough tips to cover the mounting medical bills for my grandparents and prevent their cherished family home from slipping away into foreclosure amid the endless cycle of repairs and rising costs that plagued so many families in these parts. I was Emily Harper, a 42-year-old woman who had long ago set aside her aspirations for community college and a career in social work because Grandpa Joe and Grandma Ruth, with their frail bodies and unyielding spirits forged from years of immigrant hardships, depended on me to navigate the labyrinth of doctor's appointments, prescription refills, and the quiet dignity of maintaining the only stability they had left after building a life from nothing. In post-war America, my brother David, the ambitious lawyer who had escaped to the towering skyscrapers of Chicago years earlier, would occasionally descend upon us like a storm cloud during his rare visits, his polished demeanor and expensive suits contrasting sharply with the worn linoleum floors and faded curtains of our home, where he would sip his black coffee at the diner counter and deliver his cutting remarks about how I was destined to remain trapped in this subservient role, declaring with that infuriating certainty that I would never escape the confines of my apron while he paraded his successes as evidence of what true ambition could achieve. That particular afternoon unfolded with the usual frenzy of the lunch rush, where farmers in mud-caked boots debated crop yields over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, while retirees lingered at their booths nursing slices of apple pie and swapping stories of bygone eras that mirrored the simple yet profound values our grandparents had instilled in us during childhood summers spent fishing by the creek or helping in the garden that now stood overgrown and neglected due to their declining health. David arrived precisely on schedule, his sleek sedan pulling up outside with a purr that seemed to mock the rattling pickup trucks in the lot, and he strode in carrying his leather briefcase, as if it were a scepter, settling onto his favorite stool with an air of entitlement that made the other patrons glance sideways while I forced myself to maintain composure amid the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. He ordered his standard burger without hesitation, but as I turned to relay it to the kitchen, he leaned forward just enough to ensure his voice carried to the nearby tables, including the one occupied by Mabel, our longtime regular who had watched David and me grow up. And he remarked with a smirk that twisted like a knife how I was still wasting my potential pouring coffee for meager tips in this dead-end town, predicting that I would turn gray long before shedding that symbolic apron and embracing the opportunities he claimed were reserved for those bold enough to seize them like he had done through relentless networking and late nights in law libraries. I swallowed the sharp retort rising in my throat, tasting the metallic tang of restraint as memories flooded back of all the instances where I had covered for him during our turbulent teenage years. From forging school excuses after his reckless escapades to quietly paying off the damages from that joyride in Dad's old truck before our parents even noticed. Sacrifices that he now dismissed with casual indifference while touting his high-profile cases and corner office as the pinnacle of the American dream we had both been raised to chase. A wry sense of humor bubbled up within me despite the sting, imagining how his meticulously groomed exterior concealed a soul as stingy as the wilted lettuce on his plate, but instead of unleashing the frustration, I plated his meal with an extra helping of onions piled high enough to water his eyes for the remainder of the day, a subtle act of defiance disguised as forgetfulness that allowed me to watch from afar as he picked at it grudgingly without complaint, his complaints muted by the diner's lively atmosphere. As he finished and tossed a few bills on the counter, generous by his standards, but still leaving me to bust the table alone, he rose with a parting pat on my shoulder that felt more condescending than affectionate, promising to check in soon before driving off into the horizon, leaving behind a trail of exhaust and the lingering ache of unresolved sibling rivalry that had simmered for years under the surface of our fractured family bonds. Life continued in its predictable yet exhausting cadence. With the diner's closing bell signaling the start of my second shift at home, where I would balance checkbooks under the dim kitchen light while Grandpa recounted tales of his mechanic days tinkering with engines that powered the post-war boom. His voice weakening with each passing week as emphysema claimed more of his breath, and Grandma would interject softly about their early decisions to invest wisely in small ventures that sustained them through lean times, her arthritic hands trembling as she folded laundry that I had washed earlier. David's communications arrived sporadically through texts from his bustling urban life, filled with superficial encouragement like suggestions to apply for management at the diner or relocate to a city where my skills might fetch a better wage. But they always carried an undercurrent of superiority that ignored the reality of my choices, such as the time I had deferred my enrollment to care for them after Grandma's first stroke, a decision that bound me tighter to Milford even as opportunities elsewhere beckoned faintly in the distance. Subtle hints began to emerge in those quiet evenings, like the way Grandpa's eyes would linger on a locked drawer in his desk during our conversations about finances, or how Grandma deflected questions about their pre-marriage years with vague references to a partnership that changed everything before they settled into the routine of raising us, planting seeds of curiosity that I dismissed amid the urgency of daily survival, but which now nagged at the edges of my mind as uncertainties about their legacy and our future intertwined. The fragile equilibrium shattered one fateful night when the telephone's shrill ring pierced the silence just after midnight, pulling me from a fitful sleep to the urgent voice of a nurse at the local hospital informing me that Grandpa had suffered a severe collapse in the kitchen, his body crumpling beside the stove where he had attempted to prepare a late snack despite my repeated warnings, and by the time I arrived in a panic, tires screeching on rain-slicked roads, doctors were already stabilizing him while delivering the devastating news that Grandma had passed quietly in her sleep earlier that evening, her heart finally surrendering after years of quiet endurance that left the room echoing with an emptiness I could scarcely comprehend. In the ensuing blur of grief and logistics, David materialized at the hospital with his practiced condolences, his presence a mix of genuine sorrow and opportunistic calculation as he discussed arrangements in hushed tones with the staff. But as we returned to the now hollow house filled with their lingering scents and unfinished projects, the weight of impending decisions pressed down heavily, amplified by a mysterious envelope the lawyer mentioned in passing about an upcoming will reading that promised more than mere sentimental items. As I sat alone in the dim living room, sifting through a lifetime of accumulated mementos while the clock ticked toward dawn, a profound sense of foreboding settled over me, wondering what revelations awaited and whether they held the key to appending the imbalances that had defined our family for so long, leaving me on the precipice of a truth that could either heal old wounds or ignite conflicts I had long suppressed. The funeral services unfolded in a somber procession that blurred the line between mourning and mechanical obligation, where neighbors delivered endless trays of tuna casseroles and Jell-O salads that piled up in the refrigerator like unspoken sympathies, while David positioned himself at the center of every conversation, his arm draped around my shoulders in a gesture that felt more performative than heartfelt as he fielded questions about the estate with the smooth assurance of a man who had already mentally inventoried the assets, including the family home that now stood as an empty shell echoing with the absence of Grandpa's gravelly laughter and Grandma's gentle humming during evening chores. Back in the house after the burial, surrounded by stacks of sympathy cards and the musty scent of old photo albums scattered across the dining table, I began the arduous task of sorting through their belongings under the weight of accumulating bills that arrived daily like vultures circling the remnants of their frugal lives, mortgage statements highlighting overdue payments exacerbated by the medical expenses that had drained their savings and left the roof leaking even more insistently after a recent downpour turned the attic into a shallow pond. David's calls from Chicago came with increasing frequency during those initial weeks, his voice laced with that familiar blend of concern and condescension as he suggested selling the property outright to escape the money pit it had become, dismissing my emotional attachment with reminders that I needed to secure a real job beyond the diner shifts that had sustained us all these years. his words igniting a slow-burning frustration that I channeled into organizing closets and attics rather than confronting him directly, since family ties, however strained, still demanded a measure of restraint in the face of fresh grief. As the days stretched into a monotonous grind of estate paperwork and extended hours at the diner where the regulars offered quiet nods of solidarity over refills of decaf, I found myself grappling with the practical realities of widowhood for two souls who had intertwined their existences so completely, balancing the checkbook late into the night while the house creaked in protest against the chill of approaching winter that seeped through cracks they had once patched with their own hands. During leaner times, one rainy evening, while methodically clearing out Grandpa's cluttered desk in search of any overlooked insurance policies or bank details that might alleviate the financial strain, my fingers encountered the stubborn resistance of that locked drawer I had noticed months earlier, and with a spare key from the junk drawer finally yielding to the tumblers, it swung open to reveal a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded twine. Correspondence from a business associate dated back to the 1950s, detailing shares in a burgeoning auto parts company that our grandparents had co-founded before quietly divesting to fund their move westward and raise a family amid the uncertainties of post-war America. The discovery sent a jolt through me, illuminating fragments of their untold history where shrewd investments in engines and innovations had quietly amassed wealth hidden beneath decades of modest living and community service. Mentions of royalties and trusts that hinted at a legacy far beyond the modest home and its leaky faucets, stirring a whirlwind of questions about why they had kept such secrets buried and how this revelation might reshape the inheritance dynamics that David assumed would favor his urban expertise over my steadfast presence. That newfound knowledge fueled a spark of defiant ingenuity the following weekend when David announced his arrival to help assess the situation with the estate. Pulling up in his gleaming sedan laden with spreadsheets and a bottle of inexpensive Merlot that he presented as a peace offering while immediately launching into plans for flipping the house through a quick sale to developers hungry for small-town lots amid the suburban sprawl encroaching from nearby cities. We gathered at the scarred oak kitchen table, the same surface where childhood meals had forged our sibling bond, now serving as a battleground for his visions of profit margins and my quiet resolve to honor their wishes. And as he unrolled his charts projecting how the proceeds would allow me to start fresh in a condominium far from Milford's familiar streets, I allowed him to build his case uninterrupted until the moment he paused expectantly for my capitulation. With calculated nonchalance, I slid the unearthed letters across the tabletop, their brittle edges whispering of forgotten fortunes as I remarked how Grandpa's side hustles appeared more substantial than the footnotes in his law school case studies. Watching his confident expression fracture into a mask of calculated dismissal as he scanned the documents and muttered about their likely irrelevance in modern valuations. The witty retaliation unfolded subtly when I poured his wine with a steady hand, but accidentally nudged the glass just enough to slosh a crimson stain across his pristine spreadsheets, blurring the projected figures into abstract art while I apologized profusely with wide-eyed innocence. The irony of his meticulously planned empire dissolving in a spill, evoking an inner chuckle at how his big city bravado faltered against the unpredictability of family heirlooms and a sister's understated sabotage that left him dabbing futilely with a napkin. Yet the dilemmas intensified as I weighed the implications of those letters in the solitude of subsequent nights, torn between consulting the family lawyer independently to verify their worth or holding the information close to prevent David from maneuvering it into his favor through legal loopholes and connections that had always given him an edge in our uneven sibling rivalry. A hesitation that might frustrate onlookers who valued direct confrontation over my preference for strategic patience. Rooted in years of observing our grandparents' quiet wisdom, the house itself seemed to conspire in the growing uncertainty, its foundations shifting slightly under the strain of neglect while utility bills climbed alongside the emotional toll of decisions deferred. And David's remote encouragements via email grew more insistent, laced with attachments of apartment listings that ignored the sentimental anchors tying me to this place where every corner held echoes of holidays and hardships. Shared. Then came the pivotal twist in the form of a certified letter from the bank, its stark language threatening foreclosure proceedings if the outstanding mortgage balance wasn't addressed within 30 days. A dire notice that arrived just as David's voice crackled over the phone line urging another sale with oblivious persistence to the storm clouds gathering on my end. Staring at the papers under the harsh glow of a single lamp, the letters from the drawer spread out like a map to potential salvation. My mind raced with the precarious balance of revelations and risks when the lawyer's unexpected call pierced the tension. His tone measured yet urgent as he informed me that the will reading was accelerated to the following week and carried provisions far more substantial than anticipated, leaving me breathless on the edge of disclosures that could either fortify my position or unravel the fragile threads of family trust in ways I could scarcely imagine. The weeks following the funeral dissolved into a tense undercurrent of unresolved matters where the house, once a sanctuary of shared routines and whispered confidences, now felt like a stage set for simmering disputes as David made his uninvited return under the guise of assisting with the estate logistics, his presence transforming the quiet sorting of belongings into a series of calculated interventions that chipped away at my autonomy while relatives began drifting in from surrounding towns to offer condolences laced with their own curiosities about potential inheritances. He arrived on a blustery Thursday morning, his sedan crunching over the gravel driveway laden with file folders and a laptop that he immediately set up on the dining table, declaring his intent to streamline the paperwork for what he termed the inevitable transition of the property into more profitable hands, his words carrying the weight of assumptions that positioned him as the natural steward of our grandparents' legacy despite his years of absenteeism during their decline. As I moved through the rooms packing away fragile china and faded linens that evoked memories of holiday feasts and bedtime stories, David shadowed my efforts with suggestions to discard sentimental items in favor of space for staging the home to attract buyers eager for rustic charm in an era where urban dwellers romanticized small-town escapes, his meddling extending to rifling through drawers without permission in search of title documents that might expedite the process he had already initiated with a realtor contact from Chicago. That invasive energy prompted me to retreat into the attic during one of his impromptu inspections, where dust motes danced in the slanted light filtering through a small window as I sifted through forgotten trunks containing ledgers from the 1960s that corroborated the letters from the drawer, detailing modest but consistent royalties from a patent Grandpa had co-invented for durable engine components during the automotive surge that fueled America's post-war prosperity. Payments funneled into anonymous accounts to shield the family from opportunistic relatives or economic downturns that had tested their resolve in the past. The clues deepened the mystery of their frugality, revealing how they had methodically built a hidden nest egg through reinvestments in blue-chip stocks and real estate trusts rather than flashy displays of wealth. A strategy born from immigrant caution that now illuminated why they clung so fiercely to this home as the anchor of their American dream. Amid the uncertainties of medical crises and generational shifts, the dilemma crystallized in that dusty space, weighing the value of confronting David with this evidence to assert my stake or allowing the will's revelations to unfold naturally. A choice that tugged at my ingrained sense of fairness, even as it frustrated the impulse for immediate justice against his presumptuous overreach, knowing that onlookers might view my restraint as weakness when direct action could reclaim the narrative he was so eagerly scripting. Humor threaded through the tension during our shared lunch in the kitchen, where David expounded on market trends over sandwiches I had hastily assembled from pantry staples, his enthusiasm for demolition and redesign clashing comically with the home's quirky features like the uneven floors Grandpa had refused to level because they told a story. And I couldn't resist interjecting with a light-hearted quip about how his vision sounded more like a sterile condo than the lived-in haven that had weathered family storms from our childhood tantrums to Grandma's quiet recoveries from illnesses. The incremental revenge materialized in a moment of clever deflection when he pressed for my signature on a preliminary listing agreement, waving the pen like a conqueror. only for me to counter by producing one of the attic ledgers with feigned casualness and inquiring innocently if his high-powered clients ever dealt with such antiquated treasures that might complicate valuations. Watching his assurance waver as he flipped through the pages and blustered about needing expert appraisal, while I savored the subtle shift in power dynamics that left him second-guessing his haste. Inside, a touch of wry amusement at his discomfort bubbled up, likening his flustered reaction to a peacock stripped of its feathers in the face of humble origins he had long distanced himself from. A satisfying undercurrent to the growing conflict without escalating into outright confrontation that might alienate the few family bonds still intact. As more relatives convened for an informal gathering in the living room that evening, the atmosphere thickened with undercurrents of speculation about the estate's scope. Cousins from Cleveland sharing anecdotes of Grandpa's mechanical genius during wartime factories, while Aunt Lila nursed a glass of sherry and hinted at rumors of smart money moves from their early years that David swiftly redirected with talk of tax implications and efficient distributions favoring the capable heir. The twists emerged organically in those exchanges, such as when Uncle Ray recalled a vague family lore about a buyout from the auto company that netted enough to fund anonymous scholarships for local kids. A detail that aligned eerily with the ledgers and prompted David's sharp glance my way, sensing perhaps that I held fragments he did not, intensifying the ethical quandary of disclosure amid loyalties tested by his overt maneuvering to position himself as the executor. Viewers attuned to the strains of middle-aged family obligations might chafe at my choices to deflect rather than dominate the conversation, agreeing with the frustration of suppressed anger yet understanding the deeper currents of respect for the grandparents' intended path, as the impending revenge loomed like a shadow promising equilibrium in the face of his entitlement. The evening culminated in a private sidebar with David on the porch, rain pattering softly on the tin roof as he leaned against the railing and reiterated his plan to protect my interests by handling the sale. His tone softening into what passed for brotherly advice, but reeking of self-interest that made my skin crawl with the familiarity of past dismissals. I held my ground with measured words, alluding to the discoveries without specifics and suggesting we await the lawyer's full accounting before committing to changes that could erase the home's essence. A stance that left him pacing with irritation as he departed for his hotel, muttering about delays costing opportunities. Alone in the quiet aftermath, the weight of uncertainties pressed heavier, the potential fortune clashing with the dilemmas of stewardship and sibling reconciliation, when my phone buzzed with the lawyer's voice, grave and measured, announcing that preliminary reviews had uncovered assets totaling far beyond expectations, including liquid investments that could alter everything, his words trailing off with a caution to prepare for surprises at the accelerated reading, propelling me into a night of restless contemplation on the brink of revelations that might finally tip the scales toward the justice I had long deferred. The revelation from the lawyer's call lingered like a half-formed storm cloud over the subsequent days, where the house transformed into a reluctant hub for extended family converging ahead of the formal will reading. Cousins arriving from distant corners of Ohio with suitcases and stories that filled the air with a mix of nostalgia and thinly veiled anticipation for shares in what whispers suggested could be a substantial legacy hidden beneath our grandparents' unassuming exteriors. David seized the opportunity to orchestrate the gatherings with his trademark efficiency, converting the living room into an informal conference space complete with printed agendas for discussions on asset management and tax strategies that he doled out like a professor lecturing reluctant students. His manipulations evident in how he steered conversations toward endorsements of his proposed executorship while subtly undermining my role as the on-site caretaker by referencing my diner job as a temporary phase rather than a testament to unwavering commitment. As relatives settled into guest rooms and the kitchen brimmed with potluck dishes reminiscent of church suppers from our youth, I navigated the influx with forced hospitality, brewing endless pots of coffee and deflecting probing questions about the estate's details that David had already primed them to view through his lens of professional inevitability. the growing conflict manifesting in sidelong glances and hushed debates that pitted his urban polish against my rooted familiarity with the home's every quirk and creak. Tensions escalated during a late afternoon session around the dining table, where David unveiled a stack of legal documents outlining his vision for liquidating non-essential holdings to maximize returns. His voice rising with enthusiasm as he described how the proceeds could fund scholarships in Grandpa's name or community funds that conveniently aligned with his charitable deductions. But the undercurrent of self-interest shone through when he glossed over the house's preservation in favor of a swift sale to cover administrative fees that seemed suspiciously tilted toward his firm's expertise. Aunt Lila, ever the instigator with her sharp tongue softened only by age, challenged his assumptions by recounting a long-buried anecdote about Grandma's insistence on maintaining family ties through a secret trust established during their early marriage to protect against exactly the kind of opportunistic kin who might dilute their hard-won stability, a twist that sent ripples through the room as David's composure flickered, his quick pivot to dismiss it as folklore exposing the cracks in his narrative control. The ethical dilemma gripped me fiercely in that moment, torn between unveiling the ledgers and letters to counter his spin or preserving the element of surprise until the reading. A hesitation born from the fear that premature disclosure might fracture alliances with relatives who leaned toward his charisma. Even though deep down I knew such restraint might strike observers as capitulation to his dominance when bolder strokes could reclaim the spotlight he had stolen through years of sporadic involvement. Humor punctured the heaviness during an awkward dinner where Uncle Ray, fueled by a second helping of casserole, launched into a rambling tale of Grandpa's wartime ingenuity that devolved into a comical reenactment involving makeshift tools from the garage, prompting David to interject with a polished correction about modern patents that only highlighted his disconnect from the gritty origins they celebrated, and I seized the opening for a lighthearted barb by noting how his innovations probably involved billing by the hour rather than sweat equity, drawing chuckles that momentarily deflated his pomposity while relatives exchanged amused glances at the siblings sparring disguised as banter. The incremental revenge sharpened in a quieter exchange later that evening on the back porch, where David cornered me away from the group to press for alignment on his plans, his hand gesturing emphatically as he outlined contingencies for my relocation support that reeked of paternalistic charity, and I responded with a measured revelation of a sibling's secret from our adolescence, how I had once covered his tracks in a minor embezzlement scheme at his first job by providing an alibi that saved his budding career. Framing it not as accusation, but as a reminder of mutual debts, watching his eyes widen in discomfort as the power imbalance tilted subtly, his bluster reduced to vague assurances of fairness that rang hollow under the stars. As night deepened and the house quieted into murmurs of bedtime preparations, the twists multiplied in private reflections where I pored over additional clues unearthed from Grandma's jewelry box, a faded deed to a small investment property in Cleveland that tied into the auto parts royalties and suggested a web of assets Grandpa had diversified to ensure longevity against family discord, raising profound questions about whether they had anticipated David's drift and my endurance in their provisions. The suppressed anger simmered hotter with each interaction, especially when a cousin confided doubts about David's transparency after overhearing a phone call where he discussed referral fees with his realtor, fueling my internal debate on loyalty versus self-preservation and prompting viewers to question why I hadn't rallied the family against him sooner. Their disagreement with my choices amplifying the emotional stakes as impending revenge hovered just beyond reach. Light vulgarity colored my thoughts in those solitary hours, viewing his manipulations as the desperate flailing of a man whose empire of influence masked a petty core, but the uncertainty of the reading loomed larger, binding me in a web of dilemmas that tested the boundaries of forgiveness and fortitude. The following morning brought the family together one last time in the living room, the air electric with final speculations, as David paced with barely contained anticipation, his smug confidence radiating as he adjusted his tie and remarked on the efficiency of closure after prolonged uncertainties, assuming the windfall would affirm his stewardship while I sat quietly, heart pounding with the weight of unspoken truths. Mr. Hargrove arrived promptly, briefcase in hand and expression inscrutable, calling the informal prelude to order before transitioning seamlessly into the official proceedings, his voice steady as he began reciting the preliminaries of the will. The room falling silent in collective suspense, while David's expectant grin widened, oblivious to the storm about to break that positioned us on the razor's edge of revelations poised to redefine everything in ways that promised both vindication and unforeseen complications. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Mr. Hargrove's office in a muted glow that mirrored the tentative atmosphere as the family assembled in a semicircle of mismatched chairs. The air heavy with the scent of aged wood and fresh coffee from a nearby percolator, while David positioned himself prominently near the lawyer's desk, his posture exuding the quiet triumph of a man who had maneuvered every prelude to this moment with the precision of his courtroom victories, assuming the proceedings would validate his role as the de facto heir to our grandparents' modest empire. I settled into a seat at the periphery, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to steady the tremor of anticipation mixed with lingering dilemmas from the tangled discussions of the past days, where revelations from ledgers and letters had painted a picture of shrewd foresight that now hung over us like an unspoken verdict, relatives shifting uncomfortably as Hargrove adjusted his spectacles and began the formal recitation with a measured tone that drew out the small bequests first, distributing items like Grandpa's cherished pocket watch to Uncle Ray and Grandma's pearl necklace to Aunt Lila in a ritual that evoked soft murmurs of appreciation, yet did little to dispel the undercurrent of expectation centered on the larger assets that David eyed with undisguised eagerness. His occasional glances my way carried a patronizing reassurance, as if to console me for what he presumed would be my nominal consolation prize, a dynamic that stirred the familiar brew of resentment and restraint within me, prompting reflections on how my choices to withhold full disclosures had prolonged the suspense at the cost of immediate confrontation, a path that might have frustrated onlookers eager for a swift reckoning against his overreach. Hargrove transitioned seamlessly into the broader narrative of our grandparents' lives, recounting their journey from post-war immigrant garages where they tinkered with engine prototypes amid the roar of America's industrial resurgence to the quiet accumulation of wealth through patents and prudent investments that weathered recessions and family upheavals without fanfare, his words weaving a tapestry of resilience that highlighted their deliberate choices to prioritize community roots over ostentatious gains, details that aligned hauntingly with the clues I had unearthed, and now saw reflected in the nods of recognition from cousins who had only glimpsed the surface of their story. The suspense built incrementally as he detailed the estate's composition, enumerating savings accounts bolstered by decades of compound interest, diversified stocks from the auto boom era, and lingering royalties from that innovative component patent that had quietly padded their security, David's foot tapping an impatient rhythm beneath the desk while he interjected politely for clarifications on valuations, his interruptions underscoring the irony of his impatience given his history of distant involvement in the very lives that had sustained these assets. Humor edged into my thoughts during one such pause, envisioning his polished facade cracking like overbaked clay under the weight of revelations he couldn't litigate away. A light vulgarity in my mind dubbing his anticipation as the bloated optimism of a fox guarding the henhouse without realizing the locks had long been changed by those he overlooked. The emotional layers deepened as Hargrove addressed the provisions for equity, his gaze lingering briefly on me with a knowing glint that suggested Grandpa and Grandma had anticipated the fractures in our family fabric, crafting clauses that honored steadfast presence over sporadic ambition in ways that tested loyalties and forced reckonings with past neglects. A framework that amplified the internal conflicts I had navigated from biting my tongue at the diner to deflecting his schemes at home. Viewers might still grapple with disagreement over my earlier hesitations, seeing them as concessions to a brother whose manipulations had eroded trust. Yet the impending twist promised a poetic balance that redeemed the patience through layers of irony and justice tailored to their wisdom. The room leaned forward collectively as the lawyer reached the core disclosure, his voice dropping to a deliberate cadence that silenced even David's subtle fidgeting, declaring that the consolidated estate amounted to $6 million bequeathed primarily to Emily Harper under a singular condition designed to preserve the family home as a vibrant community center for elders and working families in Milford, complete with programming for skills training and support services that echoed Grandma's volunteer spirit and Grandpa's mentorship of local youth. The words landed like a thunderclap, freezing the assembly in stunned silence as David's face drained of color, his mouth opening in protest that died unspoken while relatives turned wide-eyed toward me. The revelation unfolding further with the stipulation that he, as the named secondary beneficiary, must commit 2 years of pro bono oversight for the renovations and operations under my sole direction, leveraging his legal acumen to navigate permits and funding without compensation or the option to delegate, or else forfeit his modest ancillary inheritance entirely, a humbling tether that transformed his expertise from a tool of dominance into one of enforced collaboration, silencing his years of mockery through the clever irony of binding his future to the very apron strings he had derided. The ultimate revenge crystallized in that instant, witty and satisfying as I met his gaze across the room, seeing the dawning realization that his big city escapes had blinded him to the depth of their foresight, a reversal that evoked an inner surge of vindication laced with complex emotions, for while the condition empowered me to honor their vision and secure the home's legacy, it also thrust dilemmas of forgiveness and family reconciliation into sharp relief, questioning whether I would wield this leverage with mercy or finality. In the hushed aftermath as signatures were prepared and congratulations mingled with awkward queries, the ambiguity settled like a thoughtful fog, leaving me to ponder the paths ahead. Enforcing the terms to foster healing through shared purpose or negotiating leniency that might rebuild bridges without compulsion, the weight of self-worth intertwined with the American ideals of perseverance and second chances that our grandparents embodied, prompting reflections on whether true inheritance lay in dollars or the quiet strength to choose beyond revenge, a resolution hanging open-ended as the family dispersed into the uncertain light of new beginnings.